Um, Climate change and vulnerability, that's the topic. And usually what is being done to assess vulnerability is more or less this one. So people reason basically from hazards, climate hazards, flooding, drought, etc., to exposures, or what is the probability of that happening, then what is the response of the system, the sensitivity, with such and such a degree of drought, what happens to the crop or whatever, and then you get your kind of impact estimate of how that is impacting. And what is it's very difficult then when you go in this order of reasoning and research to then look at the social aspects, because you really start with a kind of biophysical hazards and then fitting that into the local context of livelihoods and agricultural systems and farm household economies is really, really difficult. So what we try to do on a number of research sites where we're working, Bioversity and CCAVs, is to turn it around. So to start with the food security and then do an assessment of the different dimensions of vulnerability of food security, where you reason backwards. So you start on the right hand, then you go back to the different hazards and how they interact and on food security. Also looking at gender differences and other rights issues in those. And so we've collaborated with the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex in the UK, implementing a toolkit that looks at basically 5 dimensions of vulnerability on food security, and it includes livelihood strategies, well-being and perceptions of well-being and goals in life of the people, adaptive capacity of individuals and households, and also collective adaptive capacity, and then also governance and power relations. And we did that in 2 sites. The picture has shifted, but it's in Colombia and in Tanzania, and the 2 pictures are of the different research efforts that we did there in order to develop this further this toolkit, and also and so what I want to present is a few like highlights from the different studies that give us some insights about how this works in practice. So this is in Tanzania. So one of the things what we found is that it's really difficult in a limited time to really find out about all these dimensions of vulnerability. It's quite complicated, and you need more kind of long-term social research to do this. And we also need to tap in better into social research that is already going on these sites. There are lots of local experts actually that know the sites. And when we opened it up, what is really interesting we found was a case on millet that so millet is quite drought resistant. It's probably a good way to deal with drought, but to grow it, there's all sorts of issues then that came into play in terms of livelihoods. So the young boys need to scare the birds away. It's difficult to process for the women, so the labor issues, etc. So you kind of, by going from food security backwards, you kind of open a Pandora's box of all sorts of things that have an impact on actually being able to create this adaptive capacity. The other thing that we found in Tanzania is that it's not easy in these types of settings to make people really reveal what their plans are to do about vulnerability. There's a lot of kind of strategic things involved that involve kind of intra-household politics that people are not always eager to talk about in a workshop, and especially not when there are men present. And in Colombia, it's quite different in terms of what we found. What we found in Tanzania was that women had quite divergent perspectives on vulnerability, but in Colombia we found far more agreement. What we also found in Colombia is that actually one of the main influences on poverty is actually whether you are a female-headed household or not. In spite of what Jenner said, in this particular setting, that is a major factor. So women, and then of course the gender norms kick in because women don't have access to certain activities. So they mainly very low value production of a crop called fike, which is a kind of fiber crop which gives very low revenues, and that was the main source of income for female-headed households. What we also found was that the main influence here was a very dry environment, that access to land and water were actually the main drivers of vulnerability in these landscapes. And those are really difficult to overcome with only technology. So more like general conclusions. It's not easy to implement these and to really get a comprehensive view of what is going on locally. And that limits a little bit what we can do about scaling. So how could we do this massively to inform decision-making about climate-smart agriculture? That probably means tapping into local resources of social sciences, local universities, and creating these capacities maybe also in agricultural programs. And especially making these types of studies parts of trajectories of intervention rather than more academic studies, so that we look at the skills and the skill sets of say, NGOs, universities, and so on that are drivers of change, and we build this into their capacities. And then a last point I would like to make is that what we think I missed in this study is looking at the types of ideas that people themselves have about gender norm change and how they see the future. So there's an approach called an inductive rights approach, where people look at what types of norms exist locally that correspond to kind of human rights norms, equality, the value of the life of a person, etc. And interventions then can pick up on those local notions and reinforce them through interventions without imposing foreign views, so to say, on people's lives. I think that is something that I think would be very interesting to look more at. So how can gender norm change really become part of intervention models? From a kind of an inductive rights perspective, I think is a useful one. Thank you.